The cold wind wasn't the only thing that made your heart ache. On the side of the road, in a snowbank, lay a shepherd dog curled around her three tiny puppies. Her fur was dusted with frost, and her eyes held a desperate hope that no one could ignore. She trembled, but she didn't move. Her motherly love was stronger than the freezing cold and fear. Who could have abandoned her here, in such a harsh winter, all alone? This story will touch you deeply. Friends, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories about animals who deserve our attention and care. The road stretched endlessly, a stark ribbon of white cutting through the barren winter landscape. Snowflakes swirled in the frigid air, carried by a biting wind that howled across the empty plain. Alongside the road, where the snow piled high into irregular drifts, a small shape lay motionless, barely distinguishable from the frozen expanse around it. It was a shepherd dog, her body huddled tightly against the elements. Her fur, once thick and vibrant, was now matted with frost, turning her into a nearly lifeless silhouette against the icy backdrop. Beneath her, shielded as much as her trembling form could manage, were three tiny puppies. Their fur was sparse, their fragile bodies too small to withstand the cruel embrace of winter. They burrowed into her warmth, seeking the life she stubbornly clung to. The mother's eyes told a story of endless endurance. Wide and dark, they stared into the distance, unfocused yet filled with a haunting mix of pain and resolve. There was no hope in those eyes, only the instinctual determination of a mother protecting her young. She had no expectation of rescue, no anticipation of kindness. Yet, she stayed, her shivering frame forming the only barrier between her puppies and the merciless cold. Her breath came in faint, visible puffs, each exhale a testament to her will to survive. The puppies, too weak to whimper, huddled silently against her chest. Their tiny bodies moved slightly with each shallow breath, fragile signs of life that she refused to let slip away. Despite the snow pressing in around her, despite the numbing cold that crept into her very bones, she lay unmoving, her body a makeshift shelter. The road beside her was eerily quiet. Tire tracks, partially obscured by drifting snow, hinted at occasional travelers who had passed by, unaware or unwilling to stop. The dog's position, low and hidden among the drifts, made her easy to overlook, but her sheer stillness spoke volumes. She wasn't waiting for anyone, she was simply holding on, a final act of defiance against an uncaring world. Above, the sky was a dull gray, the sun obscured by thick clouds that seemed to press down on the earth. The only color in this bleak scene was the faint brown of her fur, muted by the frost. The puppy's small, dark faces occasionally peeked out from the protective curve of her body before retreating again, their tiny movements the only sign of their presence. Though abandoned and left to face the elements alone, the shepherd was not truly alone. Her puppies were her reason to fight, the fire that kept her heart beating even as the cold tried to extinguish it. Her love for them was palpable, radiating from her in the form of this last, desperate act of protection. The snow piled higher around her, the wind howled louder, but she remained steadfast, a living testament to the power of a mother's love in the face of impossible odds. The wind rattled against the thin windows of the old car as it trudged slowly down the desolate winter road. The vehicle, a relic of decades past, groaned with every mile, its worn tires crunching through the snow-covered pavement. Inside, an elderly man gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale against the faded leather. The heater barely worked, and the cold crept into the cabin, but he pressed on. His eyes, sharp despite his years, scanned the road ahead. The world outside was an endless sea of white, broken only by the skeletal forms of leafless trees that lined the horizon. He was no stranger to solitude, this road was one he'd traveled many times before, a lonely path between his small farmhouse and the distant town where he bought supplies. But today, something felt different, though he couldn't yet place why. As he drove, his attention was caught by a strange sight up ahead. At first, he thought it was just another drift of snow, piled up by the relentless wind. But as his car crept closer, he noticed something unusual. The mound wasn't still. It moved ever so slightly, a faint, almost imperceptible shift against the frozen backdrop. His grip on the wheel tightened, and he leaned forward, peering through the frost-lined windshield. The movement was there again, a subtle trembling that sent a ripple of unease through him. He slowed the car, the engine coughing in protest, until it finally came to a halt a few yards away. The wipers squeaked across the glass, pushing aside a thin layer of snow as he strained to get a clearer view. "What in the world?" he murmured to himself, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. The old man reached for his coat, a thick, patched-up thing that had seen better days, and pulled it tightly around his shoulders. The cold slapped him hard the moment he stepped out of the car, the wind clawing at his face and pulling at his hat. He trudged toward the strange lump, his boots crunching loudly in the snow. Each step brought him closer, and with each step, his heart began to beat a little faster. When he finally stood over the mound, the realization struck him like a physical blow. It wasn't just a lump of snow. It was a dog. A shepherd, to be precise. Her body was curled protectively around something, no, several somethings. Puppies. His breath caught in his throat as he took in the scene before him. The mother dog looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and defiance. She didn't move, didn't growl, but her gaze seemed to plead and warn all at once. He could see the faint rise and fall of her chest, each breath labored and shallow. Beneath her, 3 tiny puppies squirmed weakly, their fur barely visible under the snow that clung to them. The man crouched down, his joints protesting against the cold and the years of wear. "Oh, you poor thing," he whispered, his voice trembling as much from emotion as from the icy air. He reached out cautiously, his gloved hand hovering inches above her. She flinched slightly but didn't try to move away. Instead, she tightened her body around her pups, as if to shield them from whatever this stranger might bring. Every instinct in him screamed to act, to save her, to save them. He crouched down, his knees protesting against the icy ground, and extended a hand toward her, moving slowly so as not to startle her. She flinched slightly but didn't retreat, her trust teetering on the edge of survival and fear. He could see her ribs beneath her fur, the hollowness of hunger etched into her frame. Her breathing was labored, shallow, and uneven, but her gaze remained fixed on him, as if assessing whether he was salvation or another danger. The puppies stirred at his proximity, one of them letting out a weak, pitiful whine that pierced through the howling wind. That sound broke something inside him, a crack in the icy shell of solitude he'd built around himself over the years. He had always lived simply, quietly, away from the complexities of human connections. But here, faced with these fragile lives on the brink of extinction, he felt an overwhelming need to protect them. He reached into his coat and pulled out the old blanket he had brought from the car. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. Carefully, he laid it on the ground next to the dog, speaking to her in a low, soothing voice. "I'm going to help you," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "I'll take care of you and your little ones. Just hold on." She seemed to understand, or perhaps she simply didn't have the strength to resist. Slowly, the man scooped up the first puppy, cradling its small, trembling body in his hands. The mother let out a low whine but didn't move to stop him. He worked quickly, wrapping each of the puppies in the blanket, their tiny forms disappearing into the folds of warmth. When it came time to lift the mother, he hesitated. She looked so frail, so worn down by the cold and hunger, that he worried she might not survive the journey. But there was no choice. With all the care he could muster, he slid his arms beneath her and lifted her from the snow. Her body was heavier than he expected, not because of strength or vitality, but because of the dead weight of exhaustion. She rested her head against his chest, her eyes closing as if the fight had finally drained from her. As he carried her and her puppies back to the car, the snow swirled around them, a cruel reminder of the danger they had narrowly escaped. By the time he placed them inside, the vehicle's meager warmth felt like a lifeline, a promise of survival. Sitting behind the wheel, he glanced at the mother dog now curled on the seat, her puppies tucked close beside her. For the first time, she let out a deep, shuddering breath, a sound that was equal parts relief and surrender. The man stared at them for a moment, his hand trembling as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, and as he drove away from the roadside, he couldn't shake the weight of what he had just witnessed. The cruelty of their abandonment was incomprehensible, but so was the resilience of their will to survive. He had found them on the brink, teetering between life and death, but now, for the first time, they had a chance. And as he drove, the man realized that their survival wasn't just their own, it had become his as well. The old man moved with deliberate care, his every action guided by a profound sense of urgency and compassion. The bitter wind bit at his face and hands as he crouched near the motionless shepherd dog and her fragile puppies. His breath formed visible clouds, mingling with the frost-covered air as he focused on the smallest lives first. The puppies were so light, so tiny, that he worried they might slip through his gloved fingers. Each one barely moved, their frail bodies shivering even as he wrapped them gently in the old blanket he'd brought. Their fur was damp, matted with snow, and their eyes remained tightly shut as if shielding themselves from the cruel world around them. He tucked them close to his chest, feeling their faint warmth through the fabric, and carried them back to the car. The old vehicle groaned as he opened the passenger side door, the cold having stiffened its hinges. Inside, the meager warmth of the engine was enough to create a noticeable contrast to the frozen landscape outside. He placed the puppies carefully on the seat, wrapping the blankets snugly around them, making sure they were shielded from the drafts that crept through the aging vehicle's cracks. He paused for a moment, glancing back at the mother dog still lying in the snow. Her form was motionless, her head resting on the icy ground as if she'd given her last ounce of strength to ensure her puppy's safety. Her body had the defeated stillness of exhaustion, yet her eyes, half-closed and glistening with frost, followed his every move. Returning to her side, he knelt down, speaking softly. "It's your turn now, girl. I won't leave you here." The dog didn't flinch as he slid his arms beneath her, his movements slow and careful. She was heavier than the puppies, her body solid yet weakened by the cold and hunger. As he lifted her, she let out a soft, almost inaudible whine, a sound that tore at his heart. He cradled her as best as he could, feeling the sharp contrast of her icy fur against his coat. Her head drooped against his shoulder, her breathing shallow and irregular, but she didn't struggle. The wind howled louder as he carried her to the car, the snow swirling around them in a chaotic dance. By the time he reached the door, his arms were trembling, not from the weight, but from the realization of how fragile her life had become. He opened the door with his elbow and gently laid her on the seat next to her puppies. They stirred faintly at her presence, instinctively pressing closer to her, and she, despite her exhaustion, managed to nuzzle them weakly. He shut the door quickly, sealing them inside the thin bubble of safety the car provided. The engine's faint rumble seemed almost soothing now, a promise of warmth and hope. He slid into the driver's seat and adjusted the vents, directing the precious heat toward the bundled family. The drive home was slow and cautious. The snow-covered road was treacherous, and his old car protested the journey with groans and creaks, but he pressed on. He glanced at his passengers frequently, his heart tightening each time he saw the mother dog's closed eyes and the still forms of her puppies. Occasionally, one of the pups would shift under the blanket, a small reassurance that life still pulsed within them. The warmth inside the car began to take effect as the minutes passed. The frost on the mother's fur started to melt, tiny droplets forming and sliding down her matted coat. Her breathing deepened slightly, a small but vital improvement that didn't go unnoticed. One of the puppies let out a faint squeak, barely audible over the hum of the engine, but it was enough to make him smile for the first time that day. The warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the icy wilderness they had just escaped. As the old man stepped through the door, the puppies bundled in his arms and the mother dog cradled carefully against his chest, the flickering firelight from the hearth greeted them like a silent promise of safety. The scent of smoldering wood filled the room, mingling with the faint aroma of the stew he had left simmering earlier. He knelt down near the hearth, setting the puppies gently on a thick, worn blanket he had laid out on the floor. They squirmed faintly, their tiny bodies responding to the heat radiating from the fire. The mother dog, still too weak to stand, let out a low, relieved sigh as he placed her beside them. Her body instinctively curved around her pups, pulling them closer even as her eyes flickered open to glance at her surroundings. "You're safe now," the man said softly, crouching beside them. His voice carried no urgency, only a soothing cadence that seemed to settle the air around them. The dog's gaze lingered on him, her amber eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and tentative trust. She rested her head on the edge of the blanket, her breath slowing as the fire's warmth seeped into her chilled bones. The man stood and moved to the small kitchen at the other end of the room. He rummaged through his modest pantry, pulling out a can of meat he had been saving for a stew. Tonight, he decided, it would serve a higher purpose. He opened it carefully, spooning the contents onto a plate before setting it down near the mother dog. The scent of food stirred her from her semi-conscious state. Her nose twitched, and she lifted her head slightly, her eyes darting between the plate and the man. "It's all for you," he murmured, stepping back to give her space. You need it more than I do. The dog hesitated for a moment, her instincts grappling with her exhaustion. Then, slowly, she leaned forward and began to eat. Her movements were cautious at first, but as the taste and nourishment reached her, she ate with more determination. The man watched silently, his heart swelling with quiet relief. Each bite she took was a victory, a step further from the brink of despair. The puppies, now warm and nestled together, had drifted into a deep sleep. Their tiny forms rose and fell with each soft breath, their fur catching the firelight in a way that made them look almost golden. The man couldn't help but smile as he glanced at them. For creatures so small, they carried an immense weight of hope and renewal. He busied himself tending to the fire, adding another log to ensure the warmth would last through the night. The crackling flames filled the silence, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the modest home. The man's movements were methodical but unhurried, his years of living alone evident in the quiet efficiency with which he cared for his space. Tonight, however, the solitude that had once been a constant companion was replaced by the soft presence of life. After ensuring the fire was stable, he returned to the blanket and sat down nearby. The mother dog had finished eating and was now licking her puppies gently, her maternal instincts reigniting now that the immediate threat of cold and hunger had passed. She glanced at the man again, her eyes softer this time, as if acknowledging his role in their survival. He reached out cautiously, his hand hovering just above her head. When she didn't pull away, he let his fingers rest on her fur, stroking her gently. "You're a brave one," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've done so much for them. Let me help now." The dog closed her eyes, leaning ever so slightly into his touch. It was a gesture of trust that brought a lump to the man's throat. He had always believed himself to be a solitary soul, content with his own company and the quiet rhythm of his days. But in this moment, surrounded by the fragile yet undeniable presence of life, he realized how much he had been missing. The night deepened, the fire burning steadily as the minutes turned into hours. The man fetched an old quilt and draped it carefully over the mother dog and her puppies, tucking them in as if they were his own family. He sat in his armchair nearby, watching them as sleep began to tug at his own eyelids. For the first time in years, the little house felt alive, filled with warmth that wasn't just from the fire. The old man leaned back, a quiet contentment settling over him. The night might have been cold and harsh outside, but within these walls, there was only peace, care, and the beginnings of a bond that would change all of their lives forever. The morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows of the old man's house, casting a soft glow across the room. The fire had burned low, its embers still faintly glowing, and the warmth lingered in the air. The mother shepherd lay quietly on the blanket, her 3 puppies nestled against her. Their tiny forms moved slightly as they slept, their breaths steady and peaceful. The man stood in the doorway to the room, a cup of steaming tea in his hand, his heart heavier and fuller than he could remember. For the first time in years, his home was no longer silent. The faint rustling of the puppies and the quiet presence of the shepherd filled the space with a sense of life he hadn't known he missed. As he watched them, a thought took root in his mind: what if this wasn't just an act of kindness, but something more? What if their meeting wasn't a coincidence? He set his cup down and moved toward the fireplace, stoking the embers back to life. The sound of the crackling would seem to stir the mother dog, who lifted her head slightly, her amber eyes following his every move. There was a softness in her gaze now, a flicker of trust that hadn't been there the night before. The man smiled at her, his weathered face warming with affection. "You've been through so much," he said quietly, as if speaking to a lifelong friend. "I don't think you were meant to leave. Maybe you're supposed to stay." The idea felt both daunting and comforting at once. His life had been a simple, solitary one, day spent tending to his small garden, repairing things around the house, and occasionally venturing into town for supplies. He had never thought of himself as someone who needed much else. Yet now, as he looked at this family of 4 who had stumbled into his life, he realized how empty his home had been. He knelt down beside the mother dog, gently resting a hand on her head. Her fur was softer now, no longer stiff with frost, and she leaned into his touch. Her trust felt like an unspoken agreement, a bond forming between them. The puppy stirred, one of them letting out a soft squeak as it stretched and yawned. The man chuckled, the sound filling the room with warmth. "All of you," he said, his voice steady with newfound purpose. You belong here now. This is your home, for as long as you want it. He spent the day making the house more comfortable for his new companions. He found an old basket in the attic, lining it with blankets to create a cozy bed for the puppies. He scoured the pantry for food that would suit them, cooking up a warm meal for the mother and carefully feeding the little ones with an improvised bottle. The work was meticulous and slow, but he felt none of his usual weariness. Instead, he was energized, driven by a sense of duty and joy. As the hours passed, the dogs began to settle into their new surroundings. The puppies explored their corner of the room with wobbly, unsteady steps, occasionally tumbling over one another in a clumsy display of curiosity. The mother dog watched them closely, her gaze darting between her pups and the man, as if silently acknowledging that he was now part of their pack. By evening, the house felt transformed. The sound of playful yips and the sight of wagging tails brought a vibrancy to the once quiet space. The old man sat by the fire, a puppy curled in his lap, its tiny paws twitching as it slept. The mother dog rested nearby, her head on her paws, her breathing deep and even. The other two puppies had found a warm spot near the hearth, their small bodies pressed together in a pile of contentment. The man stared into the fire, his thoughts wandering. He had spent so many years convincing himself that he was fine on his own, that he didn't need anyone. But now, with this small family filling his home, he realized how much he had been missing. They had given him something he hadn't even known he needed, a sense of purpose, of connection, of belonging. This is what it's supposed to feel like, he whispered to himself, his voice almost lost in the crackle of the flames. The decision to keep them felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. They weren't just animals he had rescued, they were family now. He had been given a chance to make a difference in their lives, and in doing so, they had changed his own. The house, once a place of quiet routine, was now a home filled with life, warmth, and the undeniable joy of companionship. The seasons began to shift, and with them, the rhythm of life in the old man's home found a new, harmonious beat. The shepherd dog, now stronger and filled with vitality, roamed the yard with her growing puppies trailing close behind. Each day started with the cheerful commotion of their playful energy, their small barks and excited yips breaking the stillness of dawn. The man's mornings, once filled with solitude and routine, were now spent sharing moments with his newfound family. He would sit on the porch, sipping his coffee, as the puppies tumbled over one another in the grass. The mother dog, ever watchful, would sit beside him, her head resting on his knee, her eyes following her pups with a mix of pride and devotion. She had grown into her role not just as their protector but as a cherished companion to the man. Inside the house, their presence had transformed the atmosphere. The once quiet rooms were now alive with the sound of paws skittering across wooden floors and the gentle jingling of collars. The puppies, each developing their own personalities, filled the home with laughter and light. One was bold and curious, often leading the others into harmless mischief. Another was quiet and reserved, preferring to nap by the fire or nestling into the man's lap as he read. The third was a whirlwind of energy, always chasing shadows or playing tug-of-war with an old sock. The mother shepherd, ever loyal, stayed close to the man. Whether he was tending to his garden, repairing tools in the shed, or simply taking a stroll down the dirt path that led to the woods, she was by his side. Her amber eyes, once filled with fear and exhaustion, now shone with trust and affection. She had become his shadow, a constant and comforting presence. Their bond was unspoken but profound. On evenings when the man sat by the fire, his pipe in hand and the day's work behind him, the dog would lie at his feet, her tail thumping softly against the floor. He would reach down to scratch behind her ears, murmuring words of gratitude that she couldn't understand but seemed to feel. "You've brought life back to this place," he would say. "All of you have." The puppies grew quickly, their once tiny frames filling out with strength and agility. The man built a small shelter in the yard for them to play and rest during the day, though they much preferred to be close to the house, or better yet, inside it. They had a knack for squeezing through the door at every opportunity, their tails wagging furiously as they greeted the man as though he had been gone for hours rather than minutes. Each day was a reminder of the extraordinary bond they shared. Whether it was the way the mother dog seemed to sense his mood and offer silent comfort, or the puppy's infectious joy that could brighten even the gloomiest weather, they had become an inseparable part of his world. They weren't just pets, they were family, woven into the fabric of his life. As time went on, the man often found himself reflecting on the fateful day he had discovered them on the roadside. What if he hadn't stopped? What if he hadn't looked closely enough to see the trembling lump in the snow? The thought sent a shiver through him, not from the memory of that bitter cold, but from the realization of what he would have missed. They had brought warmth to his home, but more than that, they had brought warmth to his heart. Their story wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation. It was about the power of love and loyalty to heal wounds, to rebuild trust, and to create a happiness that neither the man nor the animals could have imagined. Together, they had turned an act of kindness into a lifetime of companionship. As the sun set on another peaceful day, the man stood at the edge of his porch, watching the mother dog lead her now-grown pups into the yard for one last romp before nightfall. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, and the soft sounds of their play drifted back to him. He smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Turning back to the house, he paused, glancing over his shoulder at his lively companions. "You saved me, too," he whispered. "If you found yourself in the old man's place, what would you have done? Would you have stopped to help? Let us know in the comments below, we'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of the incredible power of kindness and compassion.